In the summer of 1989, the public was introduced to a Latin phrase that most people had never heard before, and it became the motto for the early 90s. Carpe Diem. Seize the day. We all know that phrase now, but before Dead Poets Society came out, most people hearing that Latin phrase would have considered it to be some serving of fish. Deservedly nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Lead Actor, it captivated audiences, leaving them both inspired and sad. Robin Williams' performance caught most people by surprise. At that time, he was known mostly for his comic genius, but the direction he took in his performance caught most people pleasantly off guard. But though inspiring, it leaves most viewers quite frustrated, and for good reason. While there are no clear-cut villains in this film, there are certainly attributes within certain individuals that we can aptly label them as bad guys. And there are a few to choose. The most obvious choice is Neil's father, who is overbearing and manic in the direction his son's life goes. Though admirably concerned about his son's future, his rigidity and inability to let his son communicate shows he's quite lacking in parental skills and admittedly played a part in Neil's death. How about the headmaster, Mr. Nolan? Technically not a bad guy, but his commitment to conformity and discipline does leave audiences with a bad taste in their mouths. How about Cameron? He was the one least willing to break the rules and go along with the group, and the first one to fess up. Let's be honest, most of the audience was glad to see Nwanda's fist meet his face. Did we miss anyone? That about covers it, right? Well, not exactly. What about Mr. Keating? That's right, the captain himself, Robin Williams' character. Absurd, ridiculous, you might claim. Is it? Let's take a good look at what his actions produced. He begins teaching in a school where conformity and discipline are the cornerstones of their institution, and admittedly too strict. One cannot argue that they are not one of the best preparatory schools around. And what does he do? He tells them to be free. An admirable action for sure. But what happens to young minds that are used to a set of rules when a person of authority tells them that the rules no longer matter? Well, the movie shows us. And despite the advice he received from his co-worker not to do that, Mr. Keating does anyway. Let's look at the results. Neil. Well, we know what happened to him. Now, the obvious reason is his dad, but Cameron was right when he said that if it wasn't for Mr. Keating, Neil would have been in his room studying. Face it, Neil didn't have the maturity to handle what Keating gave to him. It was confirmed when he told his dad that 10 years is a lifetime. Anybody who's an adult and has experienced their 10-year high school reunion knows that 10 years goes by very quickly. Quite often we say, "Didn't we just graduate a few years ago?" We know that as adults, but to a child, 10 years is a lifetime. His immaturity prevented him from seeing that, and rather than waiting a few years before pursuing his passion, he decided to end his life. Now, his father was certainly at fault, but there was no denying that Keating lit the match. Knox. Talk about unleashing a wolf. Inspired by Keating's teaching, Knox proceeds to assault a young woman and then stalks her at her school, embarrassing her greatly. The scene at the party where he takes a drink and whispers the words "Carpe Diem," you can almost hear Mr. Keating's voice. He did these things all while she was in a relationship with another guy, all the while professing his love for her, although he's barely even talked to her. The assault pretty much confirms what part of him was loving her. Now, some may argue that they ended up together so everything is okay, but I'm guessing most women wouldn't appreciate being assaulted by a guy who who then disrespects her and the relationship she's in. Again, another example of an authority delivering freedom in the worst way possible to an immature individual. Charlie. Granted, Charlie had a rebellious streak in him, and him being expelled eventually was a remote possibility. But inspired by Keating's teachings, his expulsion became certainty. Changing his name to Nwanda was a minor thing, but it also signified a change of attitude, turning his rebellious nature up a notch. He then proceeds to mock the headmaster and the faculty in front of the entire school. These aren't major things, especially in comparison to Neil and Knox, but his refusal to sign the letter showed his immaturity and lack of knowledge. As much as an unlikable character he was, Cameron was right. Schools have gone down because of things like that, and rather than understanding that Keating had played some part in it, Charlie decided to choose expulsion. Todd. Todd? You ask, what did Todd do? Nothing really. His standing on his desk at the end was going to get him into some trouble, but it would be quite inconsequential. No, it's not so much what he did, but what was done to him. It's the great yawp scene, quite inspiring with the dialogue, the acting, the camera movement. Yet, I couldn't help but think of what someone who had watched the movie on their reaction channel said about that scene. She said that if it had happened to her, she would have freaked out. She said that she would have been crying and hyperventilating, and just the thought of that happening to her made her squirm. Taking a shy person and putting him in the front of the class and recite some lines, embarrassing him in front of his peers, and then placing your hands on him is a risky move. Now, one could argue that Keating had been able to determine that Todd could handle it. But considering the final results of Keating's actions, that would be giving him too much credit. Face it, Keating has been given far too much leniency on his actions. Most people viewing this movie have nothing but admiration for him, his teaching, and how he taught the young people to buck the system. But what was left? The classroom was now filled with students mourning the premature death of their friend and the loss of another due to expulsion, and now going back into the realm of conformity after savoring the taste of freedom. Even the last scene highlights his faulty teaching methods, and it involves the introduction to poetry by J. Everett Pritchard. That chapter had been ripped out by the students because Keating didn't agree with it. Is that the best way to teach? I don't like it, therefore I will destroy it? Sounds a bit like censorship. He did a good job of pointing out its faults, but anyone could see that there were some good points it made. All one needs to do is look at some of the great poems in our time and ask ourselves, what makes them great? Obviously, there are some sort of criteria, some way, some scale that points out their greatness. That chapter highlighted some of the criteria. A good teacher would have been able to point out his disagreements with most of its assertions, while pointing out some of the things with which he agreed. Instead, it was torn out, instilling in the boys that if you don't agree with something, you could just rip it out. Bad guy? No. Good teacher? Not really. It's odd to see so many have so much disdain for the fuddy-duddy headmaster or the tyrant father while having such high esteem for Keating. His advice to Charlie about sucking on the marrow while not choking on the bone was right, but it was he who gave them a bone too big to do nothing for them but choke. Look at the results. Think about it. 2 kids weren't able to stay in that class, 1 to death, 1 to expulsion. There were about 20 kids in that class. That's 10% of the class that didn't make it. As a parent, would you feel comfortable having your child in a class where there was a 10% chance something bad would happen to them, primarily because of the way the teacher taught? Dead Poets Society is an excellent movie, and it's likely that the intent of the writer was to show how inspiring a teacher could be. But I think it serves more as a warning of the dangers of a certain style of teaching without understanding the maturity level of the audience, thus failing to even anticipate what sort of results it would produce. What do you think? Are you like most people who've seen this movie and think that Keating's a great teacher? Or has this video shown you a perspective you haven't considered and are now wondering why you have had so much admiration for Keating? Let us know in the comments.